Thank you all for coming. If you take a look at the book, you can see a long acknowledgments list in which I thank a number of people, some of whom are here tonight. And so I would just start off with that gratitude. And I'd like to just sketch a little bit what I think this book is about. As we know, the author is dead, so I have no more authority than you do to interpret the book, but I will anyway do this. So, on the 20th of March, 2010, the human face received an update, perhaps its first. On that day, doctors in Spain performed the first successful human face transplant. The implications for philosophy are obvious. For example, both Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Emanuel Levinas made the face crucial to their ethical programs, and this is probably the only point they have in common. Facial recognition software has made huge strides in the last decade, and now there is a potential, if cumbersome, way to defeat it. Less attention has been paid to the legal ramifications, however. We think of transplants as being of organs, after all, but the face is not exactly an organ. In fact, the face contains more than one organ, which has led to the strange legal designation, which applies to the hand and its transplant as well, vascularized composite allograft, or VCA. These VCAs are not precisely organs, although the connection work in the various systems in the grafting process during surgery would apply to a liver or to a kidney as well. The key legal change seems to be that they are composite, multifunctional, that they bear more than one traditionally conceived organ within them. And the notion of the transplant, which was of course utterly impossible before the advent of sterilized surgery, sets a new conceptual standard for the relation between organ and function. The ethics of face recognition rests on an unsettling of the question of what counts as individual if the ownership of bodily functions starts to disperse. The limitations of the human body become post-human and beckon, as the campaign to end aging is currently showing us, to some transhuman future, the dawn of which has been deferred with the death of Isabelle Dinoir, the recipient of a partial face transplant just last week. The phenotype human was tied to an arrangement of organs and systems. Intervention spells a formal update of the embodied individual. This story would ring truer if the organ had been a stable concept for more than about 150 years. But it wasn't, and its history, to which my book contributes a single, by no means exhaustive chapter, is intimately tied up with the same set of issues those Spanish doctors threw into sudden relief in 2010. The ethics of function, the meaning of physiological attributions, and ultimately the question of metaphysics after it was supposed to have come to an end. Even the post-human, transhuman debate is adumbrated in a kind of hidden discourse in the movement called early German Romanticism, which flourished for about 5 to 8 years, depending on whom you ask, on the cusp of the 19th century. It was an extraordinarily generative movement in the overlapping histories of literature, theory, aesthetics, and philosophy, as a new generation of scholars has shown, and it was recognized as a major chapter in the intellectual history of Europe around 1900. Since it has arrogated to itself through its proxies a completely new concept of art in Walter Benjamin's account, a major theory of the novel, the first non-rhetorical theory of irony, and a theory and practice of writing, often taken to be centrally associated with the fragment, that anticipates or generates the kind of careful attention to both material and symbolic construction that literary theory has long stood for. All of that was possible to say before the critical editions were finished, and not all of them are, such that with their publication in the last several decades, a new series of studies over the last 25 years or so has promoted early German Romanticism to a major piece of the German idealist puzzle, adding a metaphysics and epistemology and a glancing encounter with science to the already impressive CV of this brief movement. Cutting-edge work today has picked up the scientific angle, showing its depth. The result is a massive edifice of thinking in which the various strands can hardly be brought together. Transplanting the Metaphysical Organ makes a suggestion, by no means an exclusive one, for one generative center for romantic thought, one based in a singular use of this term organ in the textual record. The term comes from the Greek organon, which simply means tool. It was this sense of the word that Aristotle's first collators had in mind when they innocently enough called his logical and grammatical works the organon, since those works were the tools for the other parts of philosophy. Francis Bacon was building on that sense and disagreeing with Aristotle when he called his magnum opus the new organon, creating a genre designation. But you might be forgiven for thinking that Romanticism had something to do with another derivation from organon, the organ, not vascularized, certainly not composite, simply a term you encounter mostly in medical contexts and not irregularly. This term's history is surprising and fascinating because it turns out that it was not possible to call the eye or the liver an organ until well into the modern era. In the German language, the case is striking. The term simply was not used in any systematic sense until, by my estimation, the 1780s. That is, in the mid-18th century, if you wanted to say that the muscle had a particular kind of reaction to excitation, its own function or proper life, in fact, if you wanted to designate a function for any part of the body, for example, the heart, you would have to invent vocabulary. And that is exactly what Albrecht von Haller, often characterized as the first modern physiologist, did. He simply did not have the term organ, so he had to talk about excitable parts and function-performing units and so on. The body in the Cartesian imagination certainly had tools, but they were used by someone, the separate substance mind, to manipulate the profane machine. To break with that doctrine meant to imagine a new relation between function and use. The book traces that new relation in the life sciences and in philosophical metaphors in the 18th century. That is its first part because a few key conceptual turns occurred without which we cannot understand what the Romantics were doing with their term. But once they got hold of it, they take its newfangled sense, that of a function-bearing part of an organized body, and its ancient sense, that of a rational tool, and they conflate them. In other words, they made one concept out of the function inscribed in a material unit and the ability of cognition to range between its objects at different scales. The set of rules and the possibility of rule changes suddenly came into a single frame. In philosophy, what had been a search for a single set of meta-rules for genuinely informative thinking became an evolving set of engagements with material arrangements and whatever was generated by their specificity. And where the organ, once its meaning was fixed, seemed to bear a single function contributing to a phenotypical whole, an organism, it suddenly became both the enabling site of certain circumscribed possibilities and the potential location of an alteration not of a body, but of the rules of embodiment. What if the body were to be altered in its very function? Then some new vocabulary would be required. Say we started with vascularized composite allograft, with faces that are no longer anyone's in particular and organs that are no longer singular. Some new way not just of describing the world, but of engaging it in thought. By combining these two inherited senses of the word organ, the Romantics conceived of a metaphysics not as a way of describing being, but as a way of intervening in being on its own terms. In the book, I suggest that this interventionist metaphysics is in part a way to grasp the ramifications of the French and American revolutions and the ongoing instability, which would later be made permanent, of the ontology that modern science suggests. If being has no final state and society's evolution is made contingent, then metaphysics is at an end, as we have heard from Bacon to Kant to Heidegger. The Romantics, according to my understanding, thought that this was true so long as metaphysics was just a description of rules, a representation of the way things ultimately are. But in that ontologically and politically unstable world that emerged cataclysmically in the 18th century, a meta-discourse was not merely descriptive, they thought. It was actively constituting the new units of understanding, the new ontologies, the new governments. The suggestion I make then in the studies that make up the book is that metaphysics was recast as organology, a way of looking at the world that allowed for systemic intervention, not in its empirical details, but in its very constitution, in the evolution of its rules. That metaphysics is at the heart of much of the critical project since Romanticism, and especially in its Marxist variants, something the final chapter excavates from Marx's own work. I think that's a new point about Romanticism, but I also think it has a great deal to offer theory today as we renegotiate the boundaries around what have become our literal, medicalized organs, and also as we continually relitigate the rules of being in the digital and perhaps the post-democratic age. That's my description of the book. And so I think, thanks for listening to that, and I would like to turn it over to Rüdiger first.
When I asked myself why I would be here speaking about Leif's demanding and wonderfully demanding book, an episode reserved from a long time ago, and this episode will clearly show you why it has to be me. For the sake of telling you this anecdote, I have, however, to reveal something which I'm not sure Leif will agree to. but I should reveal it at once and in one short sentence, and that is that in my view, this book is about technology and not about biology, which, however, does not mean necessarily, and I add that in order not to defend the serious editors at Fordham, that it were not about forms of living, not about forme di vitae, which is, as you have seen, the subtitle or the title of the series. Anyway, here is the little personal anecdote. When I was a graduate student back in Freiburg, Germany, south of the Black Forest, I happened once to sit during a lecture next to Friedrich Kettler, with whom I was studying at the time. I remember that fact precisely. Unfortunately, I do not remember who the lecturer was and what the subject matter of the paper was he was reading. It must, however, been something bearing on the question of technology or technical media. And something must have irritated Kettler, or rather he was frustrated with something in the lecture, since Kettler was not critical with things that were not useful for his thinking, probably had no time for that kind of reaction. He was just frustrated. So he turned to me, and I have to say that the rumor was that I could read the Greek alphabet, and Kettler at that stage could not. So he said to me, "Rüdiger, you have to tell them that techne does not mean technology. Would you please?" As you might imagine, I was simply terrified. I certainly experienced that as a call upon me. I had to tell them that techne does not mean technology. The problem was that I would have thought exactly that, namely that techne meant technology, or maybe technique, but what was the difference? It was obvious that there had to be a deep and fundamental difference, a difference that was all decisive, but I didn't know it. So I can proudly say today that with this question, Friedrich Kettler had personally announced to me that in his last books he would spell out that all he ever would have to say about media was a footnote to Heidegger, to the author of The Difference Between Techne and Technology, and not just to the question of technology or the age of the world picture, but of the being and time, first of all. But more importantly for myself, I had been called upon by the question to tell the difference between techne and technology, and no reading of Heidegger, regardless of whether I understood Heidegger in this respect or not, could ever end or heal the effect of this question, of this call upon me. Now, Leif's book has become a great help for me in this context. Not that I'm proposing a Kettlerian reading of the book, or at least not a Kettlerian reading in the sense we normally think of as Kettlerian. As far as I can tell, this standard Kettler does not really play a major role in it. And not that by reading the book I finally got the right answer to what the difference between techne and technology is. Rather, the book helps me emancipating from the call, from the question, and the self-evidence that there must be this distinction. The romantic attention to the organ, that is how I read this book, is the moment of a possible indifference between techne and technology. And for me, it is exactly this moment and this indifference that constitutes its message. By shortly retracing Leif's narrative of the rise, short life, and demise of the romantic organology, I will try to spell out this idea about the indifference between techne and technology a little bit more, and then I will ask a question which, if my reconstruction is right, and if Leif is right with which I think he is saying, then I am still a little bit wondering about. So, to start with the retracing of the argument as I understand it. Early on in the introduction, Leif quotes a famous passage from Aristotle's De Anima, which can stand as a motto for the whole book, a motto more precisely for why the question of the organ is a metaphysical question. The passage reads, "It follows that the soul is analogous to the hand, for the hand is a tool of tool, an organon of organons. So the mind is the form of forms, an eidos of eidon, and the sense, aesthesis, is the form of that which is sensed or which is present in the senses, which is an eidos aestheton. I may somewhat deviate in my reading from this, but fundamentally I think the character of the sentence as a fundamental sentence for the metaphysics of technology is the same as in the book. The analogy, first of all, seems perfectly clear. The hand is an organ of organa, like the mind. The nous is an eidos of idea, a form of forms. Two spheres, two tracks of relations circling within themselves. Tool of tools, form of forms. But the way these both spheres are closely interacting with each other in themselves, interacting, I should say, in themselves, is analogous. One way of interacting only with the likes of oneself, oneself resembles the other. But then there comes a third clause, the clause about aesthesis, and this one expands the analogy. Sure, it has a similar structure as the two first parts of the analogy. The sense is the form of that which can occur in the senses, what we have to deal with in the senses. So far it is continuous with the preceding pair of analogues. But then the aesthesis is not an instance X out of a class of other X's. No, aesthesis is the form of that what the senses show us, what they bring to us. This looks very much like a crossing the aisles between the tools and the forms, between the hand and the nous, the mind. It looks like extending the analogy between A and B, between tool and form, into the ground of that analogy, the grounding of and for there being an analogy between the A and the B, between the tool and the form. Now, this design, we may say, is the argument that factors technology into metaphysics in an important and irreducible way. There is a sphere of making and producing that employs tools and instruments, and which we call the technological side, the side of techne. And there is a sphere of thinking, a sphere that operates within itself and its own world of forms and essences of things. And then thirdly, there is a way in which the two spheres are coordinated with each other. Every argument that follows this general schema is a metaphysics of technical devices, and it is an entirely surprising and yet compelling reading of German Romanticism. Leif proposes that the Romantics in this sense are Aristotelians. That means follow an essentially an Aristotelian setup. Now, the important issue and the moment open to all sorts of intervention is obviously how we understand the third part of the analogy, the part about the sense being a form of that which can resurface in or is brought about by the senses. Here we feel that we are in a world with Aristotle, in a world radically different from our own world. And that Aristotelian world seems strange, and things are like as if appended in it. We would be fine with saying that central perception is a way of presenting us somehow in physiological, mechanical way with which we perceive as the form of our mental structure and content of things. But Aristotle strikingly says the opposite. The sense is not the tool for presenting forms, but the form of what can be presented to the senses as their content. This indicates that the analogy between tool and form is in Aristotle guided by or grounded within the form. The tool, which as such operates within the sphere of tools like the form operates within the sphere of forms, nevertheless follows form. By the way, this colors already the famous Aristotelian example of the hand as the tool of tools. It's the opposite of what we call the prosthetic argument. It is not that the hammer is an extension, outgrowth of the hand, what Aristotle is saying here. What he is saying is that our hand reaches out into the sphere of tools which are out there. The hand is our tool for having access to or knowing how to use tools. we all know the next big step in the manipulation of the formula of technological metaphysics. Descartes drops the third part, and the analogy turns into a mystery. There are tools of tools, now called mechanics, and there are forms of forms, now called the thinking substance, and for the rest of it, only God can help us. And please allow me to introduce an observation at this point by Hans Blumenberg, an observation which has become my safe haven for getting somehow along with the difference between techne and technology, and this argument goes something like the following. It is with the God. It is with the God now. This God who only can help us to bring the two sides, form and tools, together, is now the Judeo-Christian God. It's, for Bloomberg, in contradistinction to even the Aristotelian demiurgus, the God who has made the world, the cosmos. This God, Bloomberg has argued, is a God of tools, a God whose solution to metaphysical problems are essentially technological. He's the artifice of the world. Descartes himself was more conservative or reticent at this point, and this is why Leif, I think, correctly starts with Leibniz and not with Descartes. Anyway, the relevant point can be captured in a passage from Leibniz I take again from the book, and which reads something like a rewriting of the Aristotelian sentence we heard a moment ago. Here is Leibniz. I quote, "And beyond all this, we also have improved the organon organorum, the organ of the organs, namely correct logic and the art of invention, Erfindungskunst, far better than the ancients, both through the analysis speciosa, which is another word for characteristica universalis, is universal calculus of thinking, as well as by other means, such that one can say our understanding is not less armed hereby as our eyes are by the telescope." End quote. Here we have the promise, or some would even say the threat, of technology at its best, and as opposed to Aristotle's techne of the sense as the form of all that which occurs in it. Thinking and the use of tools alike, and that is, I think, the new formula for the analogy, are now informed by the organorum. It's now a technical or technological grounding of the analogy. And this is exactly not the hand that gives us access to the tools as they exist in the world, but this is now the metaphysical grounding of the analogy between form and tool in the sphere of tools, and that is what we call technology. From Leibniz to Marx, Leif's subtitle is the trajectory of this decisive rewriting of the Aristotelian formula of technological metaphysics. To my knowledge, it is an entirely new and original observation which is proposed in this book, namely that the Romantics, according to this reading, intervene in exactly this problematic of the technological metaphysics, and this is already, I think, an astonishing claim, then, because who would have expected German Romantics to be thinkers of techne and technology? And they intervene, as you show, in a way as to redirect the course, if I may say so, back from Leibniz, back from the technology to Aristotle, to the techne, from technology to techne. This, I maintain, is an absolutely new and striking way of seeing Romanticism as a critique of Enlightenment. What Leif demonstrates is, however, not Novalis and friends orchestrating something like a full-blown return from Leibniz to Aristotle, from Christian post-Cartesian technology to Greek techne, from modern prose to the Greek poetry and epics. This is not something Lukács would dream of in the beginning chapters of his book on the theory of the novel, nor what Heidegger would dream of as a return to the Greeks, nor for that matter what is what Friedrich Kittler tries to perform in his last books. In a way, I find most persuasive in Leif's reading of Novalis what he discovers in the Romantic is an indifference between the metaphysics of techne and of technology. The Romantic organ, according to this reading, is neither entirely guided by the forms of nature nor controlled by a logica speciosa, a calculus of thinking allied with the technical information of the human senses. The Romantic organon hovers in the middle and allows studying the development of techne into technology and a retracing of technology back into techne. Against my deep inclination to have Carl Schmitt enter debates too often, I think it might indeed be fruitful to think of the Romantics, and in particular Novalis, in terms of what he has called occasionalism. With occasionalism, I do not mean, however, Schmitt's caricature of an alleged Romantic theory of politics. What I think indeed of is Nicolas Malebranche, the French philosopher, came after Descartes, the one who tried to come to terms with Descartes' erasure of the third part of the Aristotelian analogy even before Leibniz. Occasionalism in this sense does not exactly mean that God in Malebranche or the individual subject in Novalis intervenes at any given moment in the course of things in an unforeseeable way. Rather, occasionalism means that there is a certain internal logic of how things can be technically manipulated, be brought about, and neither Malebranche's God nor Novalis' subject have full control about the ways things can be brought about once the basic technology of the world has been defined. Malebranche's God and Novalis' subjects are free to exercise their will as they wish, but the technological setup of the world defines the points of intervention where and how they can do so. This, it seems to me, is a model for a romantic indifference of techne and technology, which we can identify at least in Novalis, and which may allow, with some fine-tuning, an interesting update for our own situation today. And here's my question or concern. As I said from the beginning on, this is, for me, a book on technology, techne, rather than about biology. Transplanting the Metaphysical Organ would have been a self-defeating title, at least at least until recently in Germany, because it seems to announce a biological reading, and that has been the absolute no-go in German-speaking lands. Any organicist argument would have been forbidden territory. But I'm not here to bother you with our German ideological burdens after the Nazis. That is not what I mean to bring up. What I, however, am asking myself is what kind of a relation there might be between this brilliant claim of an hitherto unappreciated philosophy of technology in Romanticism and the obvious failure of this generation, of the Romantic generation, in performing biology, in the life sciences, as we say today. Goethe, and in particular Schelling, to put it politely, have not earned that much respect in the sciences, neither in their own days nor today. There may be exceptions from the rule. Think of the physiologist and writer Johann Wilhelm Ritter, or think of the young Georg Büchner working on the neural structure of certain fish he was dissecting. But that cannot be a sufficient answer. How is it that a rich thinking on technology can coincide with the disappearance from the scene of the hard sciences? And if that is what has taken place in German Romanticism, what does that say about the biological, or maybe we should rather say physiological, language in Romanticism? Is all we can say something in the direction of Jonathan Crary's rehabilitation of some of Goethe's physiology in the techniques of the observer? And perhaps even more importantly, what does it say about the philosophy of technology as such, which has become so prominent in the first part of the 20th century, and in particular in Germany? it almost seems as if for quite some time philosophy of technology has been a predominantly German branch of philosophy. Who else worried about the difference between techne and technology like the Germans did? Like they before, and particular after the Nazis and World War II. This question brings me to the last and concluding remark on a figure which is mentioned in the book but somehow beyond its historical scope. I mean Ernst Kapp, who is often credited with having composed, a German philosopher, who is often credited with having composed the first work with the actual title, Philosophy of Technology, 1877. First of all, I bring this up because Kapp should be the patron of all American-German endeavors in the philosophy of technology of media. He was a liberal who was driven out of his position as a professor at a German gymnasium, and Kapp lived for 2 decades in the so-called Latin settlements in Texas before he returned to Germany and authored his philosophy of technology. So I always wondered what this American episode in his life might have done for him to become this first philosopher of technology in German language. Kapp appears at first sight as the modern inventor of the prosthesis argument, or as the Kittlerians would have had it, as the anthropologization of technology, which was the worst thing you could do for Kittler. You know the thinking, each tool or machine is the extension of a body part or a physiological function, and Kittler used to make fun of this argument by asking the question, what the hell the wheel is an extension of? So I know there is an answer in Kapp to this question, but unfortunately I've forgotten it and I couldn't look it up for tonight. But what I want to say, for all the fun of that criticism, this is not what Kapp actually says in his book. That's not really his argument. What he wants to say is that tools and technology, what he wants to say is that he's a young Hegelian philosopher, and he wants to make an equivalent argument to the argument Hegel is doing about the ethical as an objectification of the human will. Like the institution of the ethical life in Hegel, education, law, and science is an objectification of will, but not its outgrowth or its extension. So is the technical world in Kapp an objectification of human physiology and psyche, but not an extension, whatever that means in the first place. The humans recognize, according to this theory, their soul and body in the mirror of techne and of technology, with all the possible meaning such a procedure may have for someone who has read Lacan's Stade du Miroir. This seems to me to be to offer an alternative alternative ending to romantic organology, an alternative compared to the catastrophic and soteriological and found in Marx and in Heidegger. And that is what I think the study helps us getting away from. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif, for inviting me to this event. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here, and it was a great pleasure to read your book. It's a very complex and, as you said, demanding book, so I had to focus on one aspect in order to, prepare this little response. So over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I would like to focus on one of its many narratives, and that's the narrative concerning the role of literature. Still louder? Okay. Reading a study like yours, which is primarily concerned with metaphysics and discusses a long history of scientific and critical thought, including figures such as Leibniz, Kant, Herder, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and Marx, among many, many others, one might assume that literature plays just a minor supporting role in this book. And it is certainly true that the bibliography of texts we might call literary is much shorter than the list of so-called theories. The term literal comes up frequently. After all, the book centers on a period in which the organ as an actual literal word infiltrated Romanticism, but seldom do we encounter literature as a genre. Yet, if one looks more closely, the link between literature and the theoretical discourses in his analysis, the way in which Leif introduces literature, gives us a slightly different picture. Although not discussed extensively, literature is not insignificant at all. On the contrary, it seems to be indispensable to his history and theory of organology. There are at least 3 significant instances of literature in Leif's book, associated with Hölderlin, Novalis, and Goethe respectively, and each of them seems to play a crucial role in his narrative. And I will not be able to recapitulate the entire reading of these authors. I will just try to highlight a few key aspects or key points. Hölderlin, Novalis, and Goethe represent 3 different periods in the history of German Romanticism: its beginning or inauguration, a sort of climax, and a retrospective afterthought. And they also put forward distinct understandings and definitions of what literature might be. Hölderlin, Leif writes, is the inaugural thinker of Romantic organology. He turns to literature and literary genres for purely theoretical reasons. Tragedy, in particular, plays a crucial role in his metaphysics. It becomes the organ of a metaphysical investigation, not just an instrument, but a living function, Leif writes, and I quote, "the form it demands to achieve its effect, the plastical means of the metaphysical epoch." With Hölderlin, Leif defines literary genres as organs of the mind. Hölderlin has, quote, "literalized what 18th century Kant had offered only metaphorically." Hölderlin responds to Kant's critical philosophy with a concept of a dialectical organ and a turn from pure philosophy to genre theory. Literature seems to become a means of resolving the contradictions that philosophical discourses of the 18th century could not overcome. The schisms of Kant's distinctions between intuition and cognition, or between being and judgment, is what Hölderlin responds to. For him, a new tool was needed that could resolve the contradictions and cut across some of the resolute dichotomies that had dominated metaphysics. But Hölderlin does not just want to reconcile what he perceives as a series of separations in the history of philosophical ideas. For him, tragedy does not simply unite opposed terms, but rather, as a genre, it is a possible representation of these contradictions. And I quote, "The genre as organ made metaphysics literary, because it put the ambitions of the organ of philosophy into concrete and restrained written form. It approached internal contradictions with tragedy." Hölderlin's tragedy is a dialectic genre because it is able to represent contradictions as contradictions. And this is what purely philosophical discourses were not able to achieve. With Hölderlin, the genre becomes the organ of metaphysics, not merely its instrument, but its living function. One might argue that these are rather general claims about Hölderlin's metaphysical literature in a grand narrative of 18th century literature and thought. But within his narrative, Leif proceeds with small steps and close readings, with meticulous and thorough analysis of his sources. In the case of Hölderlin, Leif demonstrates in readings across his oeuvre how Hölderlin became occupied with the organ. But at the same time, he presents a focused reading of Hölderlin's specific writings. In his commentary on Empedocles, for example, Leif shows how each character stands for a different form of reasoning, and how the tragedy as a whole reflects the conflicts between its figures. They have mimetic worldviews or a finite consciousness, etc., conflicting understandings of the world which motivate the dramatic action. Yet at the same time as the tragedy stresses the conflicts and contradictions between its figures, it makes something else graspable that could not be represented otherwise. What defines the tragic genre as a dialectic genre is, according to Leif, comparable to Kant's intellectual intuition. I quote, "The contradiction produced, that of an organ of intellectual intuition, is the desideratum of the organological tragedy," he writes. The Hölderlin chapter is exemplary for Leif's study. It juxtaposes the analysis of Hölderlin's metaphysical thought with readings of Kant and others, the history and theory of the tragic genre, and with a close reading of a drama. Moreover, it shows that Leif's history of the organ or organology is also a theory of literature within its epistemological setting. In more general terms, one could describe the entire book as a study on literature and thought, with a particular focus on how literary texts respond to their specific contexts. In other words, and more precisely perhaps, one could describe the book as a study that focuses on the and in literature and thought. And with each instance of literature, it offers a different approach to how the relation between literature and thought can be conceived. Leif's book is guided by its material rather than by a specific theoretical language, and each author exemplifies a different poetic model. For the second instance of literature, Leif's reading of Novalis, the genre is important too, but it does not define Novalis' notion of literature, at least not exclusively. Novalis' thinking on the organ is primarily driven by the problem of function. The organ is now defined as a technology or technique, as a specific mode of writing. Novalis, Leif writes, understood himself as a practitioner of new forms of writings that might generate new forms of thought. Romantic organology became technical, indeed technological, in his writings. And again, my remarks will be brief. The most significant contribution to organology is Novalis' Encyclopedia. The Romantic Encyclopedia is the genre of romantic organology, Leif writes. In fact, one of his encyclopedia entries, Novalis addresses organology. He is the one who coins the term, and defines the organ as a tool that is both immediate and mediated through its product. This concept, too, is a response to Kantian philosophy, as the organ seems to replace what Kant defined as the faculties of the mind. Novalis' Encyclopedia is a system of organs that displays our mind, and with it the creation of a world that itself becomes one of our organs. The organ therefore comes to designate both a cognitive act and its content. Many critics have commented on Novalis' Encyclopedia and suggested several different keys to its understanding. The fragments were read as a semiotic exercise, as a catalogue of scientific models, a religious or mystical treatise, to name just a few. By taking Novalis' organology at its word, Leif does not just add yet another perspective to the existing spate of scholarship. The point of his reading seems to be that the organ or organology refers to an underlying principle, a mode of production that explains why these notations could be read in so many different ways. It is therefore less a clearly defined genre than a mental map of a certain technique and function. The encyclopedia is less concerned with the actual contents of its notations than with the mode of its production. While with Novalis, the organ as genre becomes technological, a tool of production that can be applied to anything. Finally, a third and last instance of literature, Goethe. His novels are mentioned throughout the book. Novalis, for instance, is introduced as a reader of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's years of apprenticeship. When Wilhelm completes the process of his education, Goethe writes, Wilhelm saw the nature as if through a new organ, suggesting that Wilhelm now has the educational experience to have orientation in the world. The organ seems to be the instrument that granted him this knowledge. It stands for a beginning or for Wilhelm's passage into maturity, and thus also a break in the novel. That Wilhelm's education is completed also means that a new narrative can begin. The admittedly brief and only section in which the organ is mentioned, the sentence, Wilhelm saw the nature as if through a new organ, is nevertheless crucial for the novel and its organization. The organ is associated with a break, and yet it also seems to make a continuity possible. Organs in the novel, Leif writes, are literally organological because they both unite and divide. The novel organ is the function that allows for the narrative bridging of continuity and discontinuity. From a purely formal perspective, this description of the educational novel is not unlike Hölderlin's notion of the dialectic tragedy, a genre which he also described as a representation of conflicting perspectives. The tragedy, too, seems to represent continuity and discontinuity. But Goethe comes after organology, and the Goethe chapter comes after Novalis, although Novalis developed his idea of the organ as function, as a reader of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. As we saw, Novalis' redefinition of this passage was much more radical than the merely metaphorical organ he encountered in Goethe's educational novel. But despite this discontinuity, the discontinuity in your book now, Goethe comes after organology because he cites a trope in order to introduce it into his literature. Whereas Hölderlin defined the literary in response to a metaphysical challenge, and Novalis as a mode of writing, Goethe seems to distance the literary from this philosophical origin. Correspondences between literature and thought are merely analogies in two distinct spheres. When Goethe writes about the organ, he seems to cite an image, a metaphor, or a theme. Three instances of literature and three different definitions of literature, or the role of literature. The organ as genre, as a mode of writing, and as a topic of literary texts. And in each case, I would argue the and between or within literature and thought is defined in a slightly different way. The first instance of literature is associated with the emergence of a literary genre from a history of philosophical discourses, and it is also the beginning of literary Romanticism. The second is associated with a mode of writing and, in a way, the climax of literary Romanticism. The third does not say much about specific literary forms or modes of writing, but about Goethe, the polymath who wrote about the organ in a number of different texts and from a retrospective point of view. In the first instance, the and between literature and thought seems to define a moment when literature emerges from metaphysics. The second is much more radical because a distinction between literature and thought is no longer possible. What Novalis understands as organ is literally universal. His encyclopedia is mapping the mind of its producer. In the third case, with Goethe, the end in literature and thought seems to separate both spheres again. Hölderlin inaugurates, Novalis defines organology, Goethe finally is introduced as a reader of the aforementioned. In response to my shortened and certainly oversimplified version of Leif's reading of literature, one might say it is not so surprising that the poetics of these authors are distinct, and one might ask, a bit provocatively, if one were to put the organ and organology in parentheses, transplanting the organ from Leif's book, so to speak, what exactly would his study add to our understanding of literature? Particularly since each chapter seems to define the organ in a slightly different way, as metaphor, in a literal sense, as a genre, as mode of writing, technology, or organon, to mention just a few of the connotations the organ takes on over the course of this book. And I don't know how you would respond, or react to this, to these questions, but I would argue that one of the many achievements of his book is what I try to address a bit clumsily with the and between literature and thought, because the organ is precisely this, the in-between of metaphysics and literary Romanticism, the link between literature and thought that cannot be reduced to one simple mechanism. It cannot be described with one coherent theoretical concept, but has to be reconceptualized and redefined depending on its specific historical contexts. And I would add that precisely because the organ takes on different forms and transformations, it is so productive for this book. Although Leif draws on such a long history of literature and thought, he does not simplify, shorten, or limit this history. On the contrary, he unfolds complexity and describes a series of different constellations. I would like to argue Leif's book defines the field between literature and thought from a new perspective. Organs are the interface of metaphysics and literature. Leif's book is therefore not only a first book on organology, uniquely located between several fields, it allows us to think the end between literature and thought in a new way, as medium, instrument, genre, writing, or technology. Thank you.
First of all, let me just say thank you very, very much for both of those wonderful responses. I feel very well understood and challenged in certain ways that I find delightful in this context. Oliver, I want to start with where you left off. I never asked myself what the contribution might be if there weren't any organs in the book, because I spent 6 years. If the word organ occurs on a page, I always see it first. In the Goethe chapter, one of the things I found while in Goethe was that, and the reason that he didn't come before Novalis is that he didn't start to use the word until much later in his life. It simply doesn't exist in his corpus until later. I mean, there are a few uses, but then what you see is, we maybe take away from a more traditional genre like the novel, and you read his Maxims and Reflections, essentially fragments of wisdom that are gathered in an ancient tradition, and I think that I discovered, perhaps for the first time, that there he translates the passage that you referred to, Rüdiger, from Aristotle on the hand as the tool of tools, or rather he translates, as I discovered, not the Aristotle, but a passage from Galen, the physiologist and philosopher who is quoting Aristotle at some length. And so in that moment, which comes very late in the 1820s, we see Goethe reinvest the term organ with some new energy, and then it appears significantly in some of his last letters, and it appears in the very last thing he writes, which is serially published one piece before he dies, the other piece in the days after his death. And so that convinced me that something that he had picked up on something, probably not directly from the Romantics, but that he had picked up on something that does unite the writtenness of literature, the genre, the specific constraints that are there in this, both the constraints of the material setting, which the organ suggests, but then also in these other two senses. That is, for him, it seems that the hand as the organ of organs sort of, as it were, bleeds back upwards into a kind of organicity for the mind and for the senses. That the book should be about, and thank you for this reading. That the book should be about technology and not biology is profoundly satisfying to me. One of the main points that I was polemically making in the book as far as literature is concerned is to say that Romanticism is not limited to an organicism that would have been at best boring and at most the predecessor to National Socialism, as you pointed out. But I want to pick up something that you said. This is I just came from my graduate seminar a few hours ago, where we discussed Ernst Kapp today. Coincidentally, the translator and my collaborator for the first English edition of that book are here in the audience today, along with a few of the graduate students. And there is Kapp comes to the United States, and then he finds that German axes are not the same as American axes, and he makes a huge deal out of this in the book. He says, look, the German axes, sorry, I know I'm repeating now for some students, but the German axes have these straight handles, And the American axe has the sinews of the arm are included. And we haven't gotten that far in the translation. So, but the extraordinary thing about the projection, the organ projection thesis, and what we started to see in the reading today, as we sort of closely read the first two chapters, is that it isn't just the image of the organ itself which is projected outwards, but as he puts it, also the motion, the movement of the organs. And in that respect, I think that something very interesting is going on. What we came to at the end of the session today, and which I'm only repeating here because I think it goes to the heart of your point, is that there may be some kind of qualitative motion happening. Now, qualitative motion is something that was excluded from physics as one of the founding gestures of the scientific revolution. So that if, as you put it, there is a disappearance of the philosophy of technology from the hard sciences, it could be the case, reading Campe at least, that disappearance constitutes the philosophy of technology, because the philosophy of technology is precisely something that bridges the two cultures, that looks beyond the distinction between the humanities and the hard sciences, and by doing that, it has to operate in a different rhetorical register than is possible for either a post-Stilthey humanities or whatever the philosophical register of the sciences is taken to be. Now, I say that because I think that if you ask the question then, so maybe all we get from the Romantic movement is Ritter discovered infrared light, and unfortunately Goethe was wrong about light, but he saw that the bone in the chin, and so, okay, fine, that's fair. But that is a very limited way of looking at the history of science. In one way, just as a straw man, I think it's a little bit too limited in that sense, because I think that if you go to the weirdest excesses of the Naturphilosophie movement that came after Schelling in particular, that you'll see them saying things like the chemical epoch matches with Michelangelo's style, and Michelangelo's style is feminine, and so on and so forth. Sort of a very strange language. If you look at that language through the lens of the assumption, I think, of that particular question, then you can only see it as a series of metaphors. And part of the point, which I think you pointed out in the book, is that this is not a metaphor. The organ was not a metaphor, although I wouldn't want to say it was a concept in the sort of grandiose sense of that term either. So if it isn't a metaphor, then we see there a kind of historical rhetorical register that on the one hand, yes, absolutely, seems to fall out of view because of the way that we intuitively look, and even as scholars sometimes look at this history, but seems to introduce certain kinds of binding points, material binding points, restrictions, genres, writing, what have you, that have something in common with the commentary tradition on technology since Campe. That I think is true, and I think, and then I think we can go even one step further and bind that to the final point. You started with Aristotle. We started this conversation with Aristotle, and the question then basically comes back, which is, if you said the Romantics are Aristotelians, according to me, which I was surprised by. I didn't know that, but I think that you convinced me, because now I see that if qualitative motion or a new rhetorical register is discovered there, which doesn't fall into any of the categories into which we would want to place it today, then that rhetorical register would be, in a sense, at least affine with. It would be have a familial connection to an Aristotelian system which has never experienced the quantification that as we know, is necessary for the abstraction that begins, or at least in this tradition, is usually taken to have begun in a certain moment in the 16th and 17th centuries, and so on. So that there would be, yes, something there that binds those things together. But I don't want to take it any further than that. I just want to say thank you so much for these responses, and I think that. Unless you want to respond, that we should open up to the audience to see if there are any questions.
Hi. I was fascinated by your earlier discussion about the hand and how it functions, or is it a function, or is it an organ? And then it ended with the difference between the German straight axe and the American. So I was thinking, the old adage that which came first, the chicken or the egg? So I went back to the idea of, in architecture, the Bauhaus produced this one famous saying, the form follows function. So my question is, based on everything and trying to make it more simplistic, and you said that depending on the situation, you get a certain kind of description. So is it true that form follows function, or does function follow form? Let's settle that.
I just want to say that the hand was there before the axe, I think. Rüdiger? In the notion of the organ, the form and the function are so tightly bound together that I'm not sure one follows the other. The concept is such that they're too tightly bound up with one another. Now, for a form and either a function or a material site to be bound up with one another, all you need is for the material to be altered in a certain way. That insight goes back to, well, I suppose it doesn't need a philosopher to tell you that. But in the case of the organ, what's singular is that its functions can depart, or it can evolve in some way. And because of that, that's this sort of element that was being exploited in this philosophy, so that it was no longer just form and matter being correlated to one another as the topic of metaphysics, but instead some far more volatile mixture, something that would change. And I think that may not have come out entirely in the discussion, but in the book, what I suggest is that the Romantics see everything as organs, that they really see organs as being the metaphysical structure of things. So that in that insight, they completely revise the metaphysical project, and they have a singular way of thinking about form and function in that sense. I don't know if I was able to simplify it, but that's my answer.
Perhaps, one thought in that context is that the charm of this formulation, form follows function, is perhaps also the flexibility of the formula to follow, because following allows a more, let's say, causal interpretation of it, and but it allows also for a kind of a being preformed or being informed by something. And I think part of the question is not so much what is first, but how we understand the following in the first place, whether we understand it more as a causal relationship, and then I think in that moment it's probably the function, or whether we understand it more in the sense of being informed by, and in that moment I think we are more on the form side. And what I really find so interesting in the things you are saying about the Romantics is, so to speak, this flexibility which they, so to speak, maintain and understand the relationship in a way, in the sense of this following, which allows for a certain equilibrium of both ways of understanding it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So going off of the previous conception and your answer, which was very interesting about sort of the Romantic conception of the organ as a central metaphor in a lot of in their conceptions of things, I'm wondering what you would say are the semiotic functions of the dialectics of the form of organology at its nascence and in its continuity and in its continuing development throughout Romantic thought.
I'm not entirely sure I follow.
I apologize if
No, not at all. Just can you repeat the question?
Of course.
Thanks.
Maybe I didn't write it out. Just wondering about the semiotic functions, sort of the ways in which the dialectics of organology, this dialectics was employed by the Romantics at their nascence and in the continuing, and sort of how it developed.
Oh, I see. Just the story. Yeah, the story. The story is one that, I mean, Oliver, I think, really, well, from my own understanding, captured it quite well. I mean, that it starts with a certain, it starts with this move that Hölderlin makes from his idealist underpinnings into genre theory. And what he implies there is that genres are like organs of a kind of mind, actually, if you follow the metaphor out from Kant. And then the discourse, what I was working with was just essentially the proliferation of the use of the term in very singular ways, in ways that don't speak to those senses that I was talking about. It just doesn't make sense if you think of it as a face. It doesn't make sense if you think of it as just a liver or whatever. And that those, I traced through a few exemplary romantics, and then I find them having generated a way of looking at things that then I see the aftermath of in first Goethe and then Marx. So that's the trajectory, that's what it says in the table of contents as well.
Thank you. So before Aristotle and Plato and the Greeks was India, and that famous T.S. Eliot remark about the comparison between Western philosophy and Indian philosophy about schoolboys, and that one group was schoolboys compared to the other. So I want to ask, there are a couple books I'm familiar with, and ask if you're familiar with them, and if you are, what you would say about what you've been talking about. In 1930, this Vasant G. Relly, an Indian endocrinologist, wrote this book, Vedic Gods as Figures of Biology. And he argued that all this literature was really description of the physiology. And he said, okay, soma goes through the wool filter and the two pressing stones, and it was just left at that by maybe Max Mueller and other Sanskrit scholar, German Sanskrit. He said, no, it's talking about a neurotransmitter that goes through the pineal gland and the two brain hemispheres. More recently, in '94, this MIT PhD in neurophysiology, who was an MD from Lebanon, wrote this extraordinary 600-page illustrated book called Human Physiology, where he said the 40 aspects of Veda have a one-to-one correspondence with the 40 aspects of human physiology, and even included the literature of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and arguing, Ram is the front of the brain, Krishna is the back of the brain, but in great detail. Gayatri, her abode and her 19 enclosures, are the derma and all the cell walls and the DNA, and it's really quite interesting. So, are you familiar with that? And even if you're not, what do you see as relating to your fascinating talks?
No, I'm not familiar with either of those books. I think the thing that I latched onto as you were talking is the idea that one might see in a mythological discourse something completely other, something that you could reduce it to a physiological point or something like that. I think even in Campe's work, where you might suspect almost that something like that was going on, that you wouldn't quite see that, and that instead you have here a much more a dynamic creation of terms that don't apply immediately to the body, but also don't apply immediately to any kind of theological entities or mythological entities, and so that you're operating again in some kind of rhetorical middle space, something that doesn't reduce out to one or the other in that sense. But I'll definitely take a look. So thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you.
Your depiction here has shown, and as Novalis argues, everything can be an organ. Um, I think this very much troubles the metaphysical, Western classical metaphysical distinction between interiority and exteriority. I wonder about this. I wonder about when everything can be an organ, is it an organ still of something? That is to say, if I understand correctly, organs are constitutively relational. My question is, are they structured? Or how are they structured? So usually there would be a kind of a theory of the individual, or a kind of anthropological theory that structures the relations of organs. In this romantic organology, is there a theory of individuality? And what is then the relation between inside and outside when these organs are proliferating?
Thank you. I think that's, I agree that the inside-outside distinction is essentially, it's not rendered null, like it's not gone, but it's reproduced constantly by wherever the organ happens to bind or separate, that's the dual function according to these definitions. Novalis writes, alles kann zum Organ gemacht werden. Everything can be made into an organ. And I think that point is actually quite important. There's one of Novalis' most famous passages says, the world must be romanticized. He likes these formulations. It's usually cut off in that moment, but then the corresponding point that he makes is that the world must also be logarithmicized. I'm not sure how to say that in English, but the point is that it has to be taken to what he calls the second power and then rendered back into some concrete constellation. So the one thing that I would say first is that, and I think that's where the technological point is actually rooted, is that the techne that's connected to organology is actually the process of taking some apparently naive, brute, empirical state of affairs and raising that to this second power, however that's supposed to happen. And I think it has to happen according to each individual case differently, or each individual scientific case differently for Novalis. And then the idea is that his idea is that if you retain the relationship to the original state of affairs, that the original state of affairs itself will be influenced by that shifting. And that creates, at least in my reading, a new organ. That means that what it was becomes an organ, and that the organ becomes a different organ through the operation itself. That figure of thinking is one that has become incredibly important. I think that Rüdiger pointed to that passage where Leibniz talks about the organ of organs is not the hand, but instead is binary code, essentially. I mean, what he's saying there is essentially the organ of organs is a universal language. A universal language is something that allows us to comment at such a level of generality that you would have thought that we were producing absolutely nothing, but then it turns out this changes the actual empirical state of affairs. That conception of technology comes incidentally in that piece of writing in Leibniz is defending the idea that there should be new societies for the German language, and thinking about along the lines of the so-called fruit-bearing society in the 17th century. And but this shift, that shift between the hand and the code, that way, that indifference, that maybe is the indifference that maybe that Rüdiger was talking about, is one that means that it's certainly true that individuals are associated. I think you were asking also about the way in which individuals are associated with organs. There's a sense in which today individual association with organs has become literally loosened because of what I was talking about at the beginning. But this categorical or logical, epistemological loosening of that relationship seems to occur here with Novalis. Now, Novalis died before he might not have made finished works out of his fragments, but he might have collated them for us. He might have showed us a little bit more of what the vision was, or written perhaps something new along the same lines. And I think, but I do think that you can see that in the project, that he's he's shifting between those notions. And because he is the one who universalizes the notion of organology and uses the word organology, which I didn't make up, just in case anyone was wondering, that is why I sort of exemplify him in the book and say exactly that point, which is that it isn't that metaphysics disappears; it's that it becomes sort of it goes into these haphazard relationships. And then Novalis says, well, what if we made different metaphysics in different locations for different times? That's not so far from the notion of grasping the historical moment in thought that is associated with Hegel, or actually doing it for industrial capitalism, which is what Marx did, right? So I think that generative notion actually can be seen in Novalis. But if you want to be convinced of that, you'll have to read the book and then send me an email and tell me if you were or not. So
I'll be honest with you, I didn't really think I followed the argument too well, but two things came to mind. I'll mention them very briefly and then see if somehow it might stimulate some thought. One, Thomas Mann wrote a novella, and it was called The Transposed Heads. And the gist of the novel was that there were two individuals and their heads were exchanged, and then all sorts of metaphysical questions were raised as to who am I? So with that in mind, which was obviously sort of pre-science fiction, so to speak, but I recently read in the paper where there's a Chinese neurosurgeon who is seriously contemplating a head transplant. It's very, very difficult. There's an immense amount of connections that have to be done, so forth and so on. It might not be achievable for another 10 or 20 years, but it's just a matter of time before it will be achieved. Now, with these simple facts, the subject matter is organs, so I'm thinking the whole head is an organ. I'm thinking the metaphysics of all the questions that metaphysics arises. The questions of biology, we're biological organisms and systems. And I'm just curious with those two little mini stories, if anything that either you've written about, thought about, or perhaps what Goethe or others might have thought about, anything that, for any of you gentlemen, that might come to mind with that in mind. It's sort of perhaps very cutting edge, but I'm just leaving it totally open.
thank you. Gwyneth, can we just collect one last question, and then I'll yeah.
So thanks to Leif for the book, and then I was really appreciative of the responses that were so engaged and really brought out some amazing things in the book with the questions of technology and literature. And one of the things that I was curious about with regards to the themes of the book and how they might relate to the methodology of the book is particularly around the question of history. This is largely an intellectual history, and it's making some claims about what organology might mean for other conceptual issues, technology, literature. And I was curious if you felt that it also had claims to make for a methodology like intellectual history. If, for example, a kind of more stable metaphysics would posit that there are historical epochs or epistemes or something like this that kind of rupture and change. And I think this feeds into the question of technology that we see so much. Are we facing some new epoch, some new episteme? Or would an organology have to say something different? Like, you can't say, okay, this is the way that a historical epoch is. It's a much more, it's not totalizable as such. It is these different parts and functions, and they are makeable or transformable. If that would be an organology, or if that's possible, sort of organology of history, and if that does play out in the analyses or the methodology that you used in the book.
Thanks, Avi. First of all, which I very much doubt, someone transplants a head, that will be a straightforwardly metaphysical transplantation that I won't need to comment on. Everyone will know that it's a metaphysical transplantation. So I think that we'll have to wait and see. On this issue of methodology, I think so. I didn't very much wanted to avoid making an epochal distinction. I sometimes write Romanticism does, Romanticism is, whatever, as a shorthand, because we gave up arguing about that a long time ago, after the nominalisms argument from this is famous debate between Valek and anyway. The point is that the point is that that if organology were to be used as a methodology for history, it would simply be saying something exactly along those lines. I very much agree with what you said, that it would destabilize whatever the expectation was supposed to be. It would be along the lines of what Meillassoux calls extra science fiction, something in which the plane which is supposed to offer you something is so radically like the expectation is so radically taken away from it that you never know what could be there. And in that sense, yes, I do think, I do think along those lines. But then the point was not just to be able to continue commenting in that way, but that there would be something like an organology by that name that would be a way of looking at that constellation between writing, aesthetic and constraints like genres, governmental bodies or institutions, and technological arrangements. And that is exactly the sense that is given to the term organology by Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher of technology, who is not German, but still thinks about technology. But that sense, which he is sort of alighted on of his own accord, has this sort of deep root in German Romanticism, which I think offers maybe one or two things that he, at least so far, hasn't. So, well, I'd like to, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to thank everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Rüdiger and Oliver, for these wonderful responses. I'm very appreciative. Yeah, thanks, Gwyneth. Thanks to the center. Great. Wonderful.